Well, if you want to turn in your Bibles or phones, with me to Romans chapter 8. I've asked Brooks, my husband, to read verses 28.
And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose.
And verse 35.
Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulations, or distresses, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword?
That's it. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. We could read the rest of Romans too, but those two verses I want to focus on. Thank you. Thank you, sweetie. You know that we're all on a journey of faith, right? Yes. All of us. And I think we're exercising faith just to take our first steps. I don't know how many of you remember that. I don't. But as parents, you've watched your children. That's a step of faith, I'm telling you. And I had an encounter with faith when I was 4 years old that I remember vividly. My mom and dad and I were driving home late one night in western Colorado, and it seemed like we were the only car on the road. It was an old 2-lane logging road, and it was covered in black ice at that time of the year. And we were in an old Ford station wagon. I was always in the very back, and I remember my dad losing control as we started sliding. The road was at an angle. We slid toward a precipice. I believe it was the Dolores River down the bank. And I don't recall all the details about it, but I remember feeling jacked up in the car at about 45-degree angle, my dad said, and he helped my mother and me get out. As I looked back at the car, I'll never forget seeing a big V in the front of it. And it was there till he bought a new car 20 years later. And that was always my go-to. Whenever I thought that God was not around or close, I had to look at that. And I remembered how he saved us that night. It was awesome. As we started walking down the road, I stopped my parents. They had a hand on each of my hands, and I started praying. And my dad hadn't been going to church. He'd had an experience with people and God, and it turned his direction away from God. So he wasn't praying, but somehow I managed to pray a prayer. And my dad later said it must have been some kind of faith prayer, because right then a little truck started coming toward us and the headlights on us. It was dark. And we got closer and he stopped. It was an old man. And he asked if we needed a ride. And we said, yeah, but my dad said, back the way you came from. That's where we need to go. And he said, fine. He said, I don't know why, but my wife baked 2 little cakes for their grandchildren, and she insisted I go to the next town and take them to them late at night. Well, later on I knew what had prompted her to do that, and I was so glad she had a husband that just jumped in the car with the cakes and took off. So he turned around and drove us back, and I remember sitting in the front of that cab looking at those 2 little cakes, probably wishing he'd share with me, but you know, it was wonderful to know that you pray and God answers. Amen. Well, and he always does. He always does. It's not always in the way we want or the time we want, but he answers. So my faith journey continued through elementary school and then boarding academy. And that's when I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. I gave myself the very first shot of insulin on Christmas Eve. My doctor had me practice stabbing a very long syringe into an orange. And that I almost passed out. I did not relish doing this to my body the rest of my life. Well, of course, the needles that he gave me were very short in comparison. It was no problem. Well, that moment began a very emotional and physically painful journey with my chronic degenerative disease. But 7 years later, when I was 22, I worked for a year as a medical secretary at Weimar Institute. It's in Northern California. And one of the patients there, he was a retired congregational minister, He asked me a very profound question. After we'd taken a walk, I often walked with the diabetic patients there. We walked up to the water tower that overlooked Weimar's orchards and gardens and roads. It was beautiful, really early in the morning. And then he looked at me and said, "Sunnie, how's your journey of faith?" And I was 22. Nobody had ever asked me that before. And I just remember staring at him like, what do I say? What do I say? And I finally said, fine, I guess. I had no clue what my journey of faith was. And even though, like I say, we'd started out when we took our first steps, it's all a journey of faith. Well, when I was 24, I left Weimar and I moved in with my Aunt Lizzie in Sacramento. And I started my master's program in speech and language disorders. And she lived a few miles from CSUS. So I'd been walking to my classes past expensive homes with tall wrought iron gates and fences. And I had a thought that I wondered if these people knew Christ. And then I had a thought that I wanted to go and share Christ with them. And that's really unusual for me at that time in my life. I was very much an introvert. I did not want to knock on people's doors to sell anything. My father would always buy all the cookies that we were told to sell from school or whatever, because he knew I felt scared. So just a month after I'd had that thought, walking to classes, I called the Northern California conference office, and they sent a lady to show me how to go to doors with a case, very similar to this. And mine was a little smaller, not as heavy. This is Brooks's old case. And
bigger and all that.
that's right. His original case was bigger. This is a downsized one. But nonetheless, I have to say that I had an experience at one of those wrought iron gated homes when I went up with my case. I pressed the buzzer and they said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm with Home Health Education Service," which is the place we worked for. Well, they said, okay. They opened the gate. I walked right into this gorgeous palatial home, up to the front door, and they let me in. Marble floors, everything, and I set my case down thinking, wow, I didn't know they'd send in a card for this. I'd called to make an appointment, I thought. Well, come to find out, they thought I was a home health nurse. But since I'd said Home Health Education Service, they let me right in. And I thought, well, the Lord works in really mysterious ways, and this might be fun. Well, I just turned 25 then, and I had a first group meeting with other colporteurs, literature evangelists. And then I met the man I thought God wanted me to marry. And he thought so too. And he's here. So 6 months later, we were married. That was 34 years ago, this last Monday. In 1983, that was 1 year after 6 months after we got married, I developed a UTI and I was hospitalized with diabetic ketoacidosis. So my weight had dropped to 96 pounds. I tried to gain weight by eating a lot of high-calorie food. My choice of food then was lots of brown rice with peanut butter. Go figure, you know. But one time, I pushed the limit of what my stomach could hold, and that, along with many layers of emotional factors, was the impetus I needed to upchuck it all. I had just begun my slippery slide into the quicksand of bulimia. That addiction has taken my faith journey to life-threatening lows as I've struggled to hang on to Jesus while battling a growing sense of guilt, shame, and defeat. I can't describe the heaviness and the hopelessness I felt after 30 years of juggling negative, self-destructive behaviors with my inner desire to be like Jesus. I knew I'd hit rock bottom about 5 years ago when I looked into the mirror and I said, "I loathe you." Hearing those distorted words out loud really seemed to shake me right to my core. How could I hate myself when Jesus died for me? He died for all of us. I knew in my heart at that moment that I needed to believe by faith that he loved me, even while I was messing up and didn't feel good about myself. Our Father loves us no matter how many times we failed and no matter what we're struggling with. In Hebrews 13:5, he's promised never to leave us or forsake us, and I cling to that promise every day like a life preserver. I'm learning he is going to finish the work he began in us and restore our souls in the process.